"I'm not made for love," said the native woman. Lonely rancher whispered. "You're coming with me." The valley was wide and open, stretching farther than the eye could see. In the early mornings, a thin layer of mist floated over the grass, and the mountains in the distance looked soft and blue. The wind moved freely across the land, bending tall grass and brushing against wooden fences that had stood there for generations. It was a quiet place, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and silence often said more than words ever could. In that valley lived a native woman named Alara. She was known in town for her calm nature and steady hands. She worked at a small roadside diner that sat at the corner where the main highway met the old farm road. The diner was simple: 4 booths, a long counter, and walls decorated with faded photographs of the town's early days. Travelers stopped there for warm meals, and locals gathered every morning for coffee and conversation. Alara was always there before sunrise. She tied her dark hair back neatly, put on her apron, and began her routine. She brewed coffee, wiped down tables, and prepared the kitchen before the first customer walked through the door. She moved with quiet confidence, never rushing, never wasting emotion. Her face was peaceful, but there was something distant in her eyes, like she was always guarding a part of herself. The people in town respected her. They appreciated her kindness and her hard work, but they didn't truly know her. Alara did not share much about her life. If someone asked how she was doing, she would smile softly and say, "I'm fine." If someone asked about her family, she would change the subject gently. It wasn't that she disliked people. She simply believed that keeping her distance was safer. Alara had learned that lesson early in life. She grew up watching promises break and plans fall apart. She had trusted people before, only to feel the quiet ache of disappointment later. Over time, she stopped expecting anyone to stay. She stopped believing that love was something meant for her. It was easier that way. If she didn't hope for anything, she couldn't be hurt by losing it. Sometimes, during the slower hours at the diner, the older women in town would tease her gently. "You're too young to be alone," one would say with a friendly laugh. "Don't you want someone to share your life with?" another would ask. Alara would rinse a cup or wipe the counter and respond calmly, "I'm not made for love." She didn't say it with sadness. She didn't say it with anger. She said it like a simple truth, the way someone might say they prefer tea over coffee. The women would shake their heads thinking she was joking, but she was. In her small house near the edge of the hills, evenings were quiet. The house wasn't large, but it was neat and carefully kept. A woven blanket lay folded across the couch. A small shelf held books and a few framed photographs from her childhood. A single lamp lit the living room with a soft glow. Outside, the wind often moved through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and rain. Alara didn't mind the silence. In fact, she preferred it. Silence didn't make promises. Silence didn't leave. Across the valley, miles away from the diner and the small house, lived a rancher named Thomas. His land stretched wide, marked by fences that seemed to run endlessly toward the horizon. Cattle grazed peacefully in the fields, and a red barn stood strong against the sky. The ranch had been in his family for years, and he had taken responsibility for it at a young age. Thomas was known as dependable and hardworking. He woke before the sun each morning, pulling on his boots and stepping outside while the world was still dark. He fed the animals, checked the fences, and managed the land with steady dedication. His hands were rough from years of labor, and his face carried the quiet lines of someone who had spent more time outdoors than indoors. He lived alone in a wooden house near the center of the ranch. The house had once been filled with voices, family gatherings, shared meals, stories told around the table. But as years passed, people moved away and life changed. Now most evenings ended with Thomas sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner in silence. A single plate, a single chair pulled out. He didn't complain. He had grown used to it. The ranch needed him. The land gave him purpose. Still, there were moments when the quiet felt heavier than it should. One afternoon, after finishing his work earlier than expected, Thomas decided to drive into town for supplies. He needed a few tools and thought he might as well stop somewhere for a meal. The sun was high and dust rose behind his truck as he drove along the dry road. He pulled into the parking lot of the diner without much thought. It had been years since he last ate there. He stepped inside, the small bell above the door ringing softly. The diner smelled like fresh bread and coffee. A few locals sat in the booths, talking quietly. Behind the counter stood Alara. Thomas noticed her immediately. It wasn't because she was trying to stand out. She wasn't laughing loudly or telling stories. She was simply moving between tables, carrying plates and refilling cups. But there was something steady about her, something calm that drew his attention. She approached his table with a small notepad. "What can I get for you?" she asked politely. Her voice was soft but clear. "Coffee," he replied, glancing up briefly before looking back at the menu. She nodded and walked away. He found himself watching her without meaning to. She carried herself like someone who expected nothing from anyone. There was no rush in her steps, no effort to impress. Just quiet strength. As she refilled a cup at the counter, one of the older men joked loudly, "Alara, you're going to scare away every good man in this town if you keep acting so serious." A few people chuckled. Without missing a beat, she smiled faintly and said, "I'm not made for love anyway." The room grew quiet for a second before the conversation moved on, but Thomas had heard it clearly. Something about the way she said it stayed with him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't bitter. It sounded like something she had told herself many times before. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes drifting toward her again. He didn't know why her words unsettled him. He had lived alone for years without questioning it. He had accepted that life didn't always turn out the way you imagined. Yet hearing her say she wasn't made for love felt different. It didn't sound true. When she brought his meal to the table, their eyes met briefly. There was no spark of romance, no dramatic moment. Just a simple exchange of glances. But in that glance, he saw something deeper than calmness. He saw tiredness. Not physical tiredness, but the kind that comes from carrying too much alone. After finishing his meal, he left cash on the table and stepped outside. The wind greeted him again, warm and steady. As he drove back toward the ranch, her words echoed quietly in his mind. "I'm not made for love." He didn't know her story. He didn't know what had shaped her belief. But for the first time in a long while, he found himself thinking about someone other than the land and the cattle. Back at the ranch, he moved through his evening routine, but something had shifted. The silence at dinner felt more noticeable than usual. The empty chair across from him seemed to carry more weight. Meanwhile, at her small house near the hills, Alara washed the day's dishes and prepared for bed. She didn't think much about the quiet rancher who had stopped by. Customers came and went every day. Faces blended together. And yet, as she lay awake that night listening to the wind outside her window, she briefly remembered the way he had looked at her. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with understanding. She turned on her side and closed her eyes, pushing the thought away. Love was not for her. She had decided that long ago. Still, somewhere in the wide valley under the same open sky, two people who believed they were meant to live alone were unknowingly thinking about each other. And neither of them realized that this simple afternoon at a quiet diner was the beginning of something that would slowly, gently challenge everything they believed about themselves. After that afternoon at the diner, Thomas told himself it was nothing. He had simply noticed someone. That was all. People noticed each other every day. It did not mean anything. He returned to his ranch, to his fences and cattle, to the long hours under the open sky. Yet, as he worked, he found his thoughts drifting back to the quiet woman with steady hands and distant eyes. The next morning, while fixing a loose gate, he caught himself replaying her words. "I'm not made for love." The sentence had sounded so final, like a door closed gently but firmly. He did not understand why it stayed with him. He had known many people who had given up on things, but with her, it felt different. It felt like she had given up on herself. A few days later, he needed supplies again. At least that is what he told himself. The ranch always needed something: tools, feed, spare parts. He loaded into his truck and drove toward town. The road felt shorter this time. When he stepped into the diner, the bell above the door rang again. Ilara was behind the counter, wiping down a table. She glanced up, surprised for just a second before her expression returned to calm politeness. "You're back," she said simply. "Needed more coffee," he replied, though he still had half a bag at home. She gave a small nod and poured him a cup without asking how he liked it. Black, strong. She remembered. That small detail did not go unnoticed. He sat at the counter instead of a booth this time. It placed him closer to her. Not close enough to make her uncomfortable, but close enough to speak without raising his voice. The diner was quieter that afternoon. A soft radio played in the background. Outside, the sky was pale and wide. "You've lived here long?" he asked after a few minutes. "Long enough," she answered, placing a plate in front of another customer. He gave a slight smile. "That doesn't really answer the question." She looked at him briefly, studying his face as if deciding how much to say. "My whole life," she admitted. "This town is small, hard to leave once you're part of it." There was something in her tone that suggested she had tried to leave once. He did not press further. Over the next week, Thomas found himself returning more often. Sometimes he ordered a full meal, sometimes just coffee. Each visit brought small pieces of conversation, nothing too personal: weather changes, ranch life, town gossip. Ilara remained careful. She had learned that kindness did not always mean intention. She kept her answers short but respectful. Still, she could not ignore the pattern. The quiet rancher who rarely spoke to anyone was suddenly speaking to her. One afternoon, as she refilled his cup, she said gently, "You don't seem like someone who enjoys town much." "I don't," he admitted. "Too much noise." She almost smiled. "This place isn't very noisy." "Depends on the day," he said, glancing toward a loud group in the corner. For the first time, she let out a soft laugh. It was quick and light, but real. Thomas noticed it immediately. It felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The town began to notice too. At one table, two older men whispered, "Rancher S been coming in a lot lately." "Maybe he finally got tired of eating alone," the other replied. Ilara heard the comments but pretended not to. She had lived in a small town long enough to understand how quickly stories could grow. She did not want to be the center of one. That evening, after her shift ended, she stepped outside into the cooling air. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in soft orange and pink shades. She walked to her car, tired but steady as always. When she turned the key in the ignition, the engine made a weak sound and then went silent. She tried again. Nothing. She sat back in her seat, staring at the steering wheel. Of course, it had been making strange noises for weeks. She had planned to fix it when she had time and extra money. Neither had come yet. The parking lot was nearly empty now. The sky was darkening quickly. A chill moved through the air. She stepped out and lifted the hood, even though she knew very little about engines. She stared at the parts as if they might explain themselves. "You look like you're trying to convince it to start by staring at it." She turned to see Thomas walking toward her. He must have stayed inside longer than she realized. "It usually works," she said calmly, though a hint of frustration slipped into her voice. He leaned slightly over the engine, examining it without touching anything yet. "Mind if I take a look?" "You don't have to," she replied quickly. "I can figure it out." "I know," he said, "but you don't have to." Those words again, simple, steady. She stepped back and allowed him space. He checked a few things, tightened something under the hood, and then nodded for her to try again. The engine struggled but still refused to start. He closed the hood gently. "It's not going anywhere tonight." She crossed her arms, thinking. Calling someone would take time. Walking home would take hours. She did not like relying on anyone. "I can drive you home," he offered. She hesitated. Every part of her wanted to refuse. She had spent years proving she could manage on her own. Accepting help felt like weakness. But the wind was growing colder. The road to her house was long and dark. Pride would not make the car start. "Just a ride," she said firmly. "Nothing more." "Just a ride," he agreed. The drive was quiet at first. The headlights cut through the dark road. Fields stretched endlessly on both sides. "You're used to being alone," he said after a while. It was not a question. "Yes." "Why?" She looked out the window. "Because it's simpler." "Is it?" She paused. "It hurts less." The truck hummed softly as he considered her words. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "being alone hurts too, just in a quieter way." She did not respond right away. His voice held no judgment, only honesty. As they turned onto the dirt road leading to her house, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. The sky had grown heavy with dark clouds she had not noticed earlier. "You should see that," he said, glancing upward. "Storm's coming fast." She looked up as they stopped in front of her small house. The air felt charged, like the moment before heavy rain. She reached for the door handle. "Thank you for the ride." "Elara," he said quietly. She paused. "You're coming with me." She turned sharply, confusion flashing across her face. "What?" "The storm warning said this area floods first. Your house is close to the river. It's not safe tonight. I've stayed here through storms before, and you shouldn't have to risk it alone." The wind picked up suddenly, rustling the trees around her yard. The first drop of rain hit the windshield. "I don't need rescuing," she said firmly. "I'm not trying to rescue you," he replied just as firmly. "I'm offering you a safe place to wait it out." She looked at her house. It stood small but steady. It had protected her many times, but the clouds above looked heavier than usual. "I won't stay long," she said at last. "Long enough," he answered. She stepped back from her door and returned to the truck. As they drove away, rain began falling harder, tapping against the roof. Inside the truck, silence settled again. But this silence felt different. It was not empty. It was full of unspoken thoughts. Elara stared ahead, her heart beating faster than usual. She did not know why she had agreed. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the way he had said those words, not as an order but as certainty. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply drove steadily toward the ranch. Neither of them realized that this small decision, to share shelter for one night, would quietly begin to change everything they thought they understood about themselves. And as lightning flashed across the valley sky, two people who had grown comfortable with loneliness were slowly stepping into something neither of them had planned. The rain followed them all the way to the ranch. It fell harder as they drove deeper into the open land, turning the dirt road into dark, shining mud. Lightning flashed across the sky, lighting up the wide fields for a second at a time. Elara watched the storm through the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She felt unsure, but she did not say it out loud. When they reached the ranch house, Thomas parked close to the porch so she would not have to walk far in the rain. He stepped out first and hurried around to open her door. She almost told him she could manage on her own, but the rain was already soaking through her sleeves. She stepped out quickly and followed him onto the porch. Inside, the house felt warm and steady. The wooden floor creaked softly under their boots. A small lamp near the entrance gave off a gentle yellow light. The air smelled like fresh wood and something simple cooking earlier that day. It was not a large house, but it felt solid, like it had stood through many storms before this one. "You can leave your boots there," Thomas said, pointing near the door. "I'll grab you a towel." Elara removed her boots carefully, placing them neatly beside his. She looked around without meaning to. The walls held framed photographs, old black and white pictures of people standing in front of the barn. a younger Thomas beside an older man who looked proud and serious. There were shelves filled with worn books and small wooden carvings. Everything in the house looked used but cared for. Thomas returned with a clean towel and handed it to her. "Guest room's down the hall," he said. "It's simple, but it's warm." "I'm not here to be comfortable," she replied quietly. "I know," he answered. "Still, you should be." The storm grew louder outside. Rain hit the windows steadily now, and the wind pushed hard against the walls. Elara dried her hair slowly and followed him down the hallway. The guest room had a small bed, a wooden dresser, and a window facing the fields. A handmade quilt lay folded neatly at the foot of the bed. "If you need anything, I'll be in the kitchen," he said. She nodded. "Thank you." He gave a short nod in return and left her alone. Elara sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. She listened to the storm and felt something she had not expected: safety. Not because she needed protection, but because the house felt steady, strong. She reminded herself that this was temporary, just one night until the storm passed. After changing into dry clothes Thomas had offered, she walked quietly toward the kitchen. She found him standing near the stove, stirring a pot. "You didn't have to cook," she said. "I was going to eat anyway," he replied. "Thought you might want something warm." She stepped closer and looked into the pot. "Soup," he gave a small smile. "It's simple." "Simple is fine," she said. Without asking, she reached for bowls in the cabinet, moving like she had done this before. She placed them on the table and sat across from him. For a few minutes they ate in silence. The only sounds were the rain outside and the quiet clink of spoons against bowls. "This house has been here a long time," she said finally, glancing at the photographs. "My father built most of it," Thomas replied. "I just try to keep it standing. It feels strong." "It has to be," he said. "Storms don't ask for permission around here." She nodded slightly. She understood that. Life had not asked for permission either. After dinner she stood and began washing the dishes without being told. He noticed but did not stop her. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she answered, "but I'd rather help." They worked side by side quietly. The simple act felt natural, not forced. When the dishes were done, thunder shook the windows again, louder this time. The lights flickered briefly before steadying. "You ever get tired of this?" she asked suddenly. "Of storms? Of doing everything alone?" He paused before answering. "Sometimes." She dried her hands slowly. "Why didn't you leave, go somewhere else?" "This land's part of me," he said. "Leaving it would feel like leaving myself." She understood that too. Some roots grow too deep to pull out. Later that evening they sat in the living room. A small fire burned in the fireplace, giving the room a soft orange glow. Elara sat on one end of the couch, leaving space between them. Thomas sat in a chair across from her. "You don't talk much about yourself," he said carefully. "There's not much to say." "Everyone has something to say." She stared at the fire. "Talking about the past doesn't change it." "No," he agreed. "But sometimes it makes it lighter." She was quiet for a long moment. The storm continued outside, but inside the house everything felt calm. "I used to think things would be different," she began slowly. "That I'd leave this town, start over somewhere new. I thought if I worked hard enough, cared enough, people would stay." He listened without interrupting. "But they didn't," she continued. "So I stopped expecting them to." Her voice did not shake. She was not asking for sympathy. She was stating facts the way she always did. "That's when you decided you weren't made for love?" he asked gently. She gave a small nod. "It's easier to believe you don't need something than to keep losing it." The fire popped softly between them. Thomas leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe it wasn't that you weren't made for love," he said. "Maybe you just met people who didn't know how to stay." She looked up at him. His expression was calm, steady, not dramatic, just honest. "That's not how it works," she said quietly. "People leave, it's what they do. Not all of them. You can't promise that." "I'm not trying to promise anything," he replied. "I'm just saying not everyone walks away." The wind howled briefly against the house, but the walls did not shake. For the first time in a long while, Elara felt unsure of her certainty. She had built her belief carefully, layer by layer, like strong walls around her heart. But his words did not try to break those walls. They simply rested against them. They sat there for a while longer, speaking about smaller things, the cattle, the changing seasons, the way the valley looked at sunrise. Conversation flowed easier than before, not because she trusted him fully, but because he did not rush her. When the hour grew late, she stood. "I should sleep," he nodded. "Storm should calm by morning." As she walked down the hallway, she paused near one of the framed photographs. It showed a younger Thomas standing beside his father, both smiling slightly, both proud. "You miss them," she said quietly. "Every day," he answered from behind her. She turned to look at him. In that moment, she saw that his loneliness was not weakness. It was something he carried with strength. In the guest room, she lay awake for a while, listening as the storm slowly softened. The house remained steady around her. She realized she had not felt this kind of quiet in a long time, the kind that felt shared, even from separate rooms. In his own room, Thomas stared at the ceiling. He did not regret asking her to stay. He did not expect anything from it either, but the house felt different with another heartbeat inside it. Morning arrived gently. The storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the wet fields outside shine. Elara stepped into the kitchen to find Thomas already awake, pouring coffee. "Looks like you survived," he said lightly. "So did you," she replied. They shared a small smile. After breakfast, he asked if she would like to see the ranch before returning home. She hesitated only a moment before agreeing. They walked through the fields together. The ground was soft beneath their boots. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The air smelled fresh and clean after the rain. She asked questions about the land, about how long certain fences had stood, about how he managed everything alone. He answered patiently. At one point, she bent to fix a loose wire on a fence without thinking. He watched her quietly. "You don't act like someone who needs saving," he said. "I don't," she answered. "I know." There was respect in his voice, not pity, not control, just respect. As they stood looking across the wide valley, Elara felt something shift inside her. She still believed she was not made for love, but for the first time she wondered if maybe she had been protecting herself too well. The storm had passed. The sky was clear. And somewhere between the quiet house and the open fields, two guarded hearts had begun to understand each other a little more. Neither of them said it out loud, but both of them felt it. The morning after the storm felt almost unreal. The sky was bright blue, the kind of clear that only comes after heavy rain. The fields around the ranch sparkled under the sunlight, and small drops of water still clung to the fence wires. Everything looked washed clean, but inside Elara, nothing felt clear. She stood near the porch steps with her small bag in her hand. The guest room bed had been neatly made again. The towel she had used was folded carefully. She had moved through the house quietly that morning, almost as if she had never been there at all. Thomas stood a few feet away, giving her space. He had already checked on the cattle and repaired a section of fence that the storm had loosened. His routine had returned, but his eyes kept drifting back toward her. "You don't have to rush off," he said calmly. "I do," she replied. "My car, my work, my life." He nodded slowly. "I can drive you." She almost refused out of habit, but she stopped herself. "All right." The drive back to her house was quieter than the night before. The road was muddy in places, and Thomas drove carefully. Elara looked out the window, watching the familiar hills come closer. She had always loved those hills. They had been her comfort when everything else felt uncertain. But now, for the first time, they did not feel enough. When they reached her house, she saw that the river had risen during the storm. The ground near her porch was damp. If she had stayed alone, it would have been a long and anxious night. She stepped out of the truck and faced him. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "You're welcome." There was a pause, the kind of pause filled with things unsaid. "I don't want you thinking," she began, then stopped. "Thinking what?" he asked gently. "That this changes anything." He did not look offended, he simply studied her face. "It doesn't have to change everything," he said, "but it doesn't have to mean nothing either." She crossed her arms, not in anger but in defense. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." She shook her head. "If I let myself believe in something and it disappears, I don't want to go through that again." He stepped a little closer, but not too close. "I'm not asking you to believe in forever," he said. "I'm asking you not to run before anything even begins." His voice was steady. Not demanding, not dramatic, she looked away toward the hills. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered. He gave a small breath. "You think I don't know what it's like to lose people?" She turned back toward him. For a moment she saw the quiet truth in his eyes. He had lost people too, maybe in different ways, but loss was loss. "I don't want to rescue you," he continued. "And I don't need you to rescue me. I just don't think either of us should keep pretending we're better off alone." The wind moved softly between them. She wanted to argue, she wanted to say that being alone was safer, simpler, but something inside her was tired of repeating the same words. "I need time," she said finally. "Take it," he replied without hesitation. No pressure, no promise, just patience. He gave her one last nod and drove away, leaving her standing in front of her small house. The silence returned quickly. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. The folded blanket, the quiet kitchen, the lamp near the couch. She set her bag down and walked through the room slowly, almost as if seeing them differently. That night, the silence felt heavier than usual. She sat at the small table by her window and tried to read, but her thoughts drifted back to the ranch. She remembered the warmth of the kitchen, the sound of rain against strong wooden walls, the way Thomas had listened without interrupting. She had told herself for years that love was not meant for her. That belief had protected her. It had kept her steady. But now it felt like a wall that might also be keeping something out. The next day at the diner, everything continued as normal. Customers came in for breakfast. Coffee was poured. Plates were served. Laughter filled the room, but Alara felt different. When one of the older women teased her again, saying, "Did that rancher treat you well during the storm?" She did not answer immediately. Instead of saying her usual words, she simply smiled and said, "He was kind." The woman raised her eyebrows, surprised by the softer reply. Later that afternoon, when the diner slowed down, Alara found herself staring out the window toward the highway that led to the ranch. She wondered what he was doing at that moment. Fixing fences, feeding cattle, eating alone again. She shook her head slightly, trying to focus. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Thomas returned to his routine. He worked long hours, repairing storm damage and checking on animals. But the house felt different now. When he walked into the kitchen, he half expected to see her standing at the sink again. When he passed the guest room, he noticed the small detail that the bed still held a faint crease from where she had sat. He had grown used to loneliness. But now, the silence felt louder. Evenings became the hardest. He would sit at the table, staring at the empty chair across from him. Not because he expected her to fill it, but because he had seen how easily she could. Days passed without either of them reaching out. Alara told herself that distance would clear her thoughts. If she stayed away long enough, the feeling would fade. That was how it always worked. But this time it didn't. One evening, after closing the diner, she stood outside under the open sky. The valley looked peaceful. The air smelled of dry grass and earth. She realized something quietly important. She wasn't afraid of Thomas. She was afraid of hoping. Hope meant risk. It meant allowing something to matter. She thought about his words again. "I'm not asking you to believe in forever. I'm asking you not to run before anything even begins." Had she been running? The truth was uncomfortable. For years she had told herself she was strong because she needed no one. But maybe real strength meant staying when things felt uncertain. That night, she barely slept. She kept imagining the wide fields of the ranch, the steady house, the simple kindness in his voice. On the other side of the valley, Thomas stepped onto his porch and looked toward the hills where her house stood. He did not expect her to return. He did not assume anything. But he hoped, and for a man who had stopped expecting much from life beyond his land, that hope felt both fragile and powerful. Back in her small house, Alara stood before the mirror the next morning. She studied her own reflection. "I'm not made for love," she whispered softly, repeating the sentence she had said so many times before. But this time, the words did not feel as strong. Maybe she had said them to protect herself. Maybe she had believed them because it was easier than believing something else. She took a deep breath. The fear was still there. The uncertainty was still there. But so was something new, possibility. And sometimes possibility is enough to make someone turn around instead of walking away. The next morning felt different from the ones before it. The sky was clear again, wide and open over the valley. Sunlight touched the hills gently, and the air carried the soft smell of dry grass warming under the day. Alara stood outside her small house with her hands folded in front of her. She had not slept much. Her thoughts had moved in circles all night. For years, she had believed that staying alone was the safest choice. She had built her life around that belief. It had shaped her words, her habits, even her dreams. But now that belief felt less solid, not broken, just questioned. She looked toward the road that led out of town. She told herself she was not going there to make promises. She was not going to change who she was overnight. She simply needed clarity. She needed to face what she felt instead of hiding from it. Inside the ranch house, Thomas was already awake. He had finished feeding the cattle and was repairing a wooden fence that had weakened during the storm. The land stretched wide around him, quiet and patient. He worked steadily, but his mind wandered. He had not expected her to return. He respected her need for space. But the memory of her presence in the house still lingered. The way she had moved through the kitchen as if she belonged there. The way her quiet voice had filled the silence without effort. He told himself not to hope too much. Hope could be heavy if it fell. Back at her house, Alara picked up her keys. She paused only for a second before stepping into her car. The engine started this time without trouble. She took that as a small sign that things did not always break when you least expected them. The drive to the ranch felt longer than before. Every mile gave her another chance to turn back. Every bend in the road offered her an exit from uncertainty. But she kept driving. When the ranch came into view, her heart beat faster. The wide fields looked peaceful. The barn stood strong against the bright sky. She saw Thomas near the fence, focused on his work. She parked slowly and stepped out of the car. The sound of the door closing caught his attention. He looked up, surprised. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then she began walking toward him. Her steps were steady, but inside her thoughts were loud. She had practiced what she wanted to say, but now the words felt fragile. Thomas set his tools down and faced her fully. He did not smile too quickly. He did not rush forward. He simply waited. "I didn't come because I have everything figured out," she said honestly. "I didn't expect you to," he replied. She took a breath. "I've spent years telling myself I'm not made for love, that it's easier not to try." He nodded slightly, giving her space to continue. "But lately," she said, glancing briefly at the land around them, "I've been wondering if I was wrong, or maybe just afraid." The wind moved softly between them, lifting the edges of her hair. "Being afraid doesn't mean you're wrong," he said gently. She looked at him. "I don't know how to do this." "You don't have to know," he answered. "We can learn." There was no pressure in his voice, no grand promise, just patience. "I'm not promising forever," she said carefully. "I'm not asking for it," he replied. She searched his face for any sign of doubt or expectation. She found neither, only steadiness. "I don't want to feel like I owe you something because you helped me," she added. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Kindness isn't a contract." That answer settled something inside her. They stood there for a moment, the wide valley stretching around them like an open question. Finally, she said softly, "I don't want to run anymore." He let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "Then don't." The simplicity of it made her smile. He picked up his tools again. "You're just in time," he said lightly. "Fence won't fix itself." She raised an eyebrow. "You're putting me to work already. I wouldn't expect anything less." Without another word, she stepped beside him and reached for a loose wire. The metal felt cool under her fingers. Together, they worked quietly, adjusting the fence, checking its strength. There was something powerful about that moment. No dramatic confession. No sudden change. Just two people choosing to stand side by side. After finishing the fence, they walked back toward the house. The field seemed brighter than before, or maybe she was simply seeing them differently. Inside, the kitchen looked just as it had the night of the storm. The wooden table, the simple cabinets, the faint smell of coffee in the air. "You staying for lunch?" he asked casually. She hesitated only a second. "Yes." He nodded and began preparing something simple. She stepped forward without being asked and started slicing vegetables. Their movements flowed easily like they had practiced this before. "People in town are going to talk," she said after a while. "Let them," he replied. She smiled faintly. "You don't care much about that." "Not really. Do you?" She considered the question. For years she had cared about keeping her distance, about not giving anyone reason to assume things, but now that seemed less important. "No," she admitted. After lunch they sat on the porch. The sun was warm but not too strong. The valley stretched endlessly before them. A few cattle moved slowly in the distance. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I thought love had to feel dramatic, like something overwhelming." "Maybe it doesn't," he said. "Maybe it's just steady." She leaned back in her chair, thinking, "I still don't know if I'm made for it." He looked at her with calm confidence. "You don't have to be made for it, you just have to be willing." That sentence stayed with her. The afternoon passed without rush. They spoke about small things, plans for the ranch, repairs that needed attention, the changing seasons. She found herself laughing more easily. Not forced, not guarded. As the sun began to lower, painting the sky in soft gold, she realized something important. She did not feel trapped. She did not feel pressured. She felt free. Free to stay, free to leave, free to try. When she finally stood to head back to town, she did not feel like she was walking away from something fragile. She felt like she was walking toward something steady. "I'll come by tomorrow," she said casually. "I'll be here," he answered. As she drove away, she glanced in the mirror once. He was still standing on the porch, watching her go, not with fear, not with doubt, but with quiet hope. Back in her small house that evening, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt thoughtful. She sat by her window and looked at the darkening hills. For the first time, she did not repeat the old sentence. Instead of saying, "I'm not made for love," she whispered something new. "Maybe I'm still learning." Across the valley, Thomas sat at his kitchen table. The empty chair across from him did not feel as empty anymore. It felt like space waiting to be filled, not by force, not by promise, but by choice. Days turned into weeks. Ilara visited often. Sometimes she stayed for dinner. Sometimes she helped with work on the ranch. Slowly, naturally, her presence became part of the rhythm of the land. They did not rush into labels or big declarations. They built something quieter than that, something steady. She still had moments of doubt. He still had moments of fear. But instead of stepping away, they spoke about it. They stayed. And one evening, as they stood together watching the sunset over the wide valley, she realized something simple but powerful. She had not been wrong about love being risky. She had just been wrong about not being made for it. Love, she discovered, was not about being perfect or fearless. It was about choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave.